Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place where history yawned widely, sipped a lukewarm cup of porridge, and said, "Ah yes, this is quite enough action for the day." Welcome, gentle listener, to the year 1534, Northern Europe, where the skies are grey, the soup is grey, and the ambitions of minor kings are possibly a shade greyer still. Tonight's location? The pastoral coastline of Denmark, where butter was salted by the wind and history moved no faster than a damp cow. Before we drift too deeply, do give that like button a gentle nudge, before your eyelids nudge shut all on their own. Now then, the tale you're about to hear concerns a genuinely real battle, one that, despite holding the title Battle of Øksnebjerg, as dramatic as a name written under a gloomy oil painting, turned out to be so uneventful, even the sheep nearby didn't notice it was happening. But we must start with the clouds. Always, in historical Denmark, it starts with the clouds. It was June, which in Denmark means only the snow is merely emotional, not physical. The fields in the south of Funen, a Danish island that sounds like a sneeze and feels like a lingering nap, were damp from days of chilly drizzle. Puddles were more committed to the cause than the soldiers, and the wind carried the scent of wet linen and confused horses. Now let me introduce you to our first cast of slightly reluctant participants, Count Christopher of Oldenburg. Ah yes, the Count. A man whose main ambition in life seemed to be restoring King Christian II to the throne, which was quite noble, if also rather unpopular and deeply inconvenient for nearly everyone else. Imagine rooting for the least favourite contestant on a reality show that only feudal lords watch. Christopher's forces were a ragtag band of mercenaries, local peasants, disgruntled nobles, and probably a few men who just followed the sound of soup being prepared. They called themselves the Christians, not for any spiritual reason, but because everyone involved was confusingly named Christian, or Frederick, or both. Opposing them was a man of equal reluctance and modest fame, Johann Rantzau, a name that sounds like he should own several expensive moustaches. Rantzau fought for the Protestant forces loyal to King Frederick I's lineage, although, by this point, King Frederick himself was already quite dead, a small matter that didn't stop his supporters. Such are the logistics of succession wars. We're fighting for a man who's no longer breathing, but whose opinions we deeply respect. Democracy, it was not. Rantzau, ever the tactician, chose to march his troops toward Christopher's rebels across the squishiest field in all of Denmark, Øksnebjerg, a name that sounds like someone politely clearing their throat. It was not a place known for grandeur, or strategy, or anything really, except a stubborn population of marsh frogs and hay that refused to stay dry. The opposing troops gathered on opposite ends of a broad, soggy meadow, neither particularly eager to stain their boots or their reputations. Rantzau's forces numbered around 3,000. Christopher's men were roughly the same, assuming you counted the ones holding pitchforks and daydreaming about cabbages. History tells us what happened next, and by tells, I mean whispers vaguely through soggy parchment, and a clerk who possibly fell asleep mid-sentence. The battle was short, not because of any brilliant manoeuvring, but because practically no one could see anything through the rain, and one side slipped down a small hill ankle-deep in sheep byproducts. A few volleys of musket fire cracked through the veil of mist. Horses neighed in protest, as they too had very little interest in being involved. And then, it very nearly ended. Rantzau gave a quiet order to advance, realizing quite calmly that opposing forces had become distracted by a collapsing tent and some extremely popular buttered rye bread drifting on the wind. Within 3/4 of an hour, small groups of Christopher's followers had laid down their weapons, which weren't particularly good ones to start with. Resistance wilted like undercooked cabbage. The rebels trickled away without much fuss, giving the whole thing the feel of a poorly attended picnic with surprisingly aggressive referees. And just like that, the grand battle of Öxneberg came and went, without so much as a muddy epic poem to its name. One of the most decisive moments in the Count's feud, and it had roughly the amount of excitement as a civil dispute at a knitting club. But as the mist lifted and the smell of oat broth lingered heavily in the air, something peculiar began to unfold, not in arms or armament, but in whispers through the thatched rooftops of Denmark. What happened next would not involve swords, nor thrilling duels, but something far slower, yet strangely important. And when the rain finally paused, well, that's where our next tale begins. Not all battles begin with trumpets. Some begin with soporific drizzle sliding down canvas tents, and the shuffling of wet socks in sloshy boots. And so it was, as dawn yawned over the gently uninspired landscape of the Bohemian countryside in the autumn of 1618, that not a single soul felt particularly enthusiastic about fighting that day. Let us set the scene, not with fire and fury, but with fog and fumbles. Grey clouds spilled across the rooftops of the rolling hills like a great goose-down blanket, and the fields below, supposedly destined to host the first grand spectacle of the 30 Years' War, resembled nothing so much as a muddy porridge served lukewarm by history itself. The battle was to take place near the town of White Mountain, a name strikingly more impressive than the hill it described. Not so much a mountain, really, as a gentle incline where goats probably yawned at the sunrise. And yet, into this soggy, sleepy world marched two armies. On one side, the Protestant Bohemians, proud, patriotic, and deeply dissatisfied with the Habsburgs. On the other side, the Catholic forces of the Holy Roman Emperor, grim, armored, and led by men who loved Jesus but not walking in soggy armor. These two forces had arrived on the field like two guests to a dinner party who both thought it was next week, and now neither was quite sure what to do with the fruitcake. The Bohemian army, led by Christian of Anhalt, a man whose moustache was significantly more organized than his battle plan, was camped out along the ridge of White Mountain. It was not a bad position as far as elevation goes, but tragically lacking in the finer strategic elements such as morale, cohesion, and dry underwear. Meanwhile, the Imperial Army was rolling in under the command of Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly, an experienced general and part-time scowl curer. Tilly was known for his austere dress, strict discipline, and the unnerving ability to look like he hadn't slept in days without losing an ounce of composure. His troops were better trained, marginally better fed, and most importantly, they were dry for the moment. And what of the weather? Ah, sweet weather. It behaved just as you'd expect mid-November in Bohemia to behave, moody, damp, and wholly uninterested in clarifying the battlefield. The rain ebbed and flowed like a sleepy lullaby, turning grassy knolls into slightly less grassy bogs, and turning long-prepared marching orders into confusing squelches of mud and resentment. It's worth noting, too, that the Bohemian army was composed, in part, of recent conscripts, young men plucked from peaceful towns, most of whom had never seen combat, horses, or an organized lunch. Their armor clinked with theatrical enthusiasm, but little functional benefit. One fellow, it is said, wore a breastplate fashioned from an old baking tray. Whether true or folklore, it gives you a sense of the mood, homemade, hopeful, and slightly crunchy when rained upon. Meanwhile, an argument erupted in the Bohemian camp, in hushed but urgent check, regarding the breakfast situation. There was supposed to be mutton stew the night before, but the stew had turned into more of a mutton soup by morning, thanks to overnight rain leaking through the supply tents. No one likes diluted mutton before a major battle. No one. To keep morale afloat in every soggy sense of the word, a spirited preacher known only as Father Petter stood bravely on a barrel and delivered a magnificent sermon about courage, faith, and going forth into glory. Unfortunately, halfway through a particularly passionate verse about divine intervention, his barrel collapsed in the mud and took his dignity with it. The men applauded out of sympathy. Not to be outdone, the imperial side spent their morning in similar, half-hearted fashion, with ranks forming, muskets checked, and every other soldier gently wondering if this bit of hill was even the right hill. One Spanish mercenary, ankle-deep in a puddle of rustic history, summed up the mood quite eloquently. Esta es la pelea. Parece más una caminata húmeda, which, loosely translated, means, this is the battle. Feels more like a wet promenade. And still, somehow rain continued to pitter-patter on helmets and halberds alike, as if the sky itself were politely requesting a postponement. The clash to come, such as it was, would not be grand or glorious. But perhaps that's the secret charm of White Mountain's historical yawn. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't decisive, it was just damp, profoundly, beautifully damp. Soon the moment would come when someone, possibly a commander, possibly just an over-eager drummer, would stumble into history's mildest confrontation. But for now, the armies waited, and the rain continued to fall. In the next gentle chapter, we'll tiptoe toward the moment something actually happens, softly, quietly, and almost by accident. Picture, if you will, a grey dawn unfurling over the hills of southern Germany, a place known for its rolling vineyards, potato-friendly diets, and, on precisely one day in 1622, the kind of battle that manages to make a war seem more like a misunderstanding at a village fair. Welcome, dear dreamer, to the sleepy puddle of history known as the Battle of Wimpfen, not the lighting of powder kegs or the glory of cannon fire. No, this was more of a prolonged and mildly damp disagreement between two entirely unhurried armies who had clearly read the rules of 30 Years' War etiquette and decided, let's do this with slippers on. And at the absolute drizzle-drenched center of this soggy saga was General Ernst von Mansfeld, facing off against the lesser-known but delightfully named General Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly. But it is not Count Tilly we focus on tonight. It is the overlooked, overcoat-layered, and over-soaked figure of a certain General Georg Friedrich of Baden-Durlach, often called General Wimpfen, who very much did not want to be there. Or, at the very least, wanted to be there significantly drier. General Wimpfen was the kind of military man more suited to council chambers, perhaps even a tasteful bit of light siegecraft, but not full, foot-squelching battle. Yet here he stood, peering out from under a dented helmet that made him look like a melancholic kettle left out in the rain. His troops stood in soggy ranks, pikemen shifting from foot to foot, trying to keep spirits up as another light mist settled over their breakfast of damp bread and colder sausage. The field itself was a vision of brown, not chestnut or sienna or any of the more glamorous shades of the color, but full, uncompromising dirt brown, mud to the ankles, the sort of terrain where tactics go to nap. Wimpfen, for all his hesitation, had a plan, and it was, let us say, ambitious. His troops were arranged with a kind of heartfelt optimism more than precision, his cavalry poised at the ready to do something vaguely horse-related when the time came. But the problem wasn't incompetence. It was the uncomfortable reality that both sides were simply very equally matched in mediocrity. It was like a chess game between two marmots. The pieces moved eventually, but without any real malice. The morning skirmish began not with a triumphant cry, but more of a collective sigh. Arquebuses fired with a kind of reluctant wheeze. Cannonballs struck muddy earth and mostly stayed there, as if committing to the nap. Infantry advanced with the energy of men thinking about what soup might be served at camp later. From his unusually low horse, a large but deeply tired mule named Liselot, General Wimpfen observed all of this with the expression of a man mentally composing a letter to his aunt about the unfortunate weather and the utter lack of thrilling deaths thus far. "Tell the lads to hold position," he murmured to his adjutant. "Sir, they are already holding position." "Hold it harder then," he replied, before sneezing into a lace handkerchief. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield had evolved into a kind of pastoral stalemate. Occasional charges fizzled out in the face of thick mud and thicker indifference. One flank of pike-wielders spent a good half-hour attempting to coordinate a maneuver which turned out to be them standing in a slightly different part of the field. Morale was not low, it was simply comfortable. No one seemed especially angry. A local farmer passing by commented that the goats had been louder the previous Thursday. And yet, despite all this underwhelming maneuvering, some sort of outcome was technically required. The 30 Years' War had a reputation to uphold after all, even if this particular chapter felt less like a clash of titans and more like two neighbors arguing through polite letters over a shared fence. Eventually, as the drizzle turned to actual rain, Wimpfen's forces began to retreat, not in panic, but in tactical sogginess. He ordered the withdrawal himself, with the calm authority of a man who had not had dry socks since breakfast and didn't intend to die for a cause that couldn't afford adequate umbrellas. It wasn't quite defeat, more of a strongly worded exit. And so, the day ended with General Wimpfen perched in a rickety carriage, trying to dry his boots near a tragic little fire, composing the lines of a very formal report to a prince who likely wouldn't read past the first paragraph. The rain continued. The war, famously, dragged on. And as night fell over the not-so-bloody fields of Wimpfen, little fires blinked in the distance, each one a sleepy soldier brewing tea or arguing softly about who got the last dry blanket. Somewhere, beneath a waterproof tarp made of tomorrow's regrets, a map fluttered, and another general, boots squelching rhythmically with every step, wandered into a forest glen, already dreaming of flanking maneuvers that wouldn't quite work. But more on him when the moon rises once more. On the third day of drizzle, neither thick nor thin, but a sort of committed grey mist that set its own schedule. Colonel Bartholomew Witherbottom conducted the morning roll call, with an expression suggesting he'd rather be a butler in an unusually damp wardrobe. The colonel, who wore his moustache like a swordsman's flourish, was a man of immense dignity and extremely limited imagination. He believed in two things: ironing his socks for morale, and that battles should begin no later than 7:45 a.m., preferably after a light porridge. Unfortunately, the Battle of Three Sheep's Hill, perhaps the only battle named not for an act of valor, but for a herd that refused to move, had no intention of starting that day either. Rain had turned the hillside into what military experts would later call a strategic bog, though locals would describe it simply as normal. Boots sank, tents drooped, swords rusted gently in their scabbards like spoons left in dishwater. And yet, in this meticulous sogginess, something delicate and deeply boring flourished. Procedural planning. Colonel Witherbottom had handcrafted the battle plan on his personal stationery with a feather quill and the stern elegance of a man who believed proper grammar outright discouraged mutiny. The plan was 6 pages long, most of it focused on the precise angle of march, east by east, southeast, or the polite direction, as Witherbottom called it, and exactly what sort of hat should be worn by the lieutenant in charge of squinting. Tactically speaking, it was a masterpiece of petty correctness. "We shall advance at a confident shamble," the colonel had declared, neither too brisk to spoil digestion, nor so slow as to invite scorn from woodland creatures. This, alas, had not materialized due to the mud, which had evolved overnight from irritating to philosophical. Soldiers began musing aloud whether ground truly existed at all, or whether their boots were gradually being absorbed into a larger, wetter cosmos. In the muddiest patch of all, a zone nicknamed by privates as Lake Legless, Private Jeremy Boddle was attempting his 5th extraction of the morning. A former cobbler's apprentice, he'd been conscripted primarily for his ability to waterproof leather and whistle 5 notes of Rule Britannia through his ears. A rare gift, rarely helpful in combat. With his left boot now somewhere near bedrock and the right boot doing its best to follow, Private Boddle had given up on escape and instead was carving a chessboard into a biscuit tin. Tactical readiness, he called it, or at the very least, crumby entertainment. Elsewhere across the soggy camp, preparations for the imaginary battle proceeded with tremendous thoroughness. Surgeons arranged their bandages in alphabetical order. Cooks prepared rations designed to inspire reflection more than hunger. One dish, a grey stew known only as the something, was capable of inducing philosophical crises in 6 bites or fewer. There was even an official megaphone drill, a 20-minute session in which officers practiced shouting "form ranks" and "steady as she goes" in various tones, none of which had been required yet, due to the complete absence of marching, enemies, or any discernible action of any kind. Still, Colonel Witherbottom remained hopeful. War, reminded his staff, was mostly about readiness and lint brushing. A preemptive polishing, he called it, as his valet wrestled with a damp woolen epaulette that insisted on curling like a fern. To pass the hours, the troops began holding official unbattle exercises. These included mud avoidance studies, dramatic yawning contests, and a rather heated discussion on whether one could bayonet a ghost, assuming the ghost was French and insulted one's turnip. The enemy, positioned somewhere up the hill, or possibly in a nearby barn playing cards, had thus far made no move, nor had they answered any of the polite cannonball-sized invitations sent their way. Small salvos fired into shrubs, accompanied by handwritten footnotes like, "If convenient, kindly skirmish soon." That afternoon, Colonel Witherbottom convened a meeting under the Army's only dry tree, a tree that had not tried to be dry, but simply didn't care about rain in the first place. "The battle," he said, gazing nobly toward the misty ridge, "remains imminent in spirit, if not in footwork. We shall hold until the weather, or the sheep, deign to acknowledge our readiness." And with that, the colonel sipped cool tea from a tin mug shaped like a cannon. and stared into the drizzle where history waited patiently, and sheep grazed passively among the cannonballs, unbothered. But still, the tension thickened, like a soup daring someone to stir it. Something, or someone, was about to slip through the fog. Possibly a scout, possibly a goat, possibly inspiration itself, if it wasn't too damp. In the distance, a trumpet squeaked, or perhaps it was just the wind pretending to be dramatic. Sleep now, and next, we shall meet the army's most accidental spy. Now then, close your eyes, or don't, whichever makes your eyebrows feel the heavier. This evening, we find ourselves on the sleepy slope of Snoosford Hill, not far from the River Yawn, where the military ambitions of two very middling garrisons came quite energetically to a halt. The year was 1468, or possibly 1469. To be honest, even the historians can't quite decide, which is part of what makes this particular tale so marvellously mild. It was during the Great War of Forgettable Grievances, a conflict neither great nor particularly grievous, but quite successful in causing several counties to misplace their tea times permanently. As we drift into the thick, damp fog of that indifferent morning, let us recall the key players in this almost battle. On one side, the noble but narcoleptic troops of Lord Snodgrass the Sleepy, a minor baron with a major fondness for parchment maps and lukewarm ale. Snodgrass had assembled a modest force of 43 men, 12 chickens, and one particularly angry accordionist named Quentin. Facing them, in the loosest sense of the word, were the equally uninspired footmen of Lady Winifred Butterweight, who had raised a retinue of aging archers, half a choir, and 2 professional soup stirrers, all wearing matching tunics in the hue of overcooked mutton. Now, the strategic importance of Snoosford Hill cannot be overstated, because it cannot be properly stated at all. It was neither high enough to give advantage, nor fertile enough to feed anyone squatting on it. In fact, the only reason both sides marched there was due to a hilariously misprinted map that referred to the location as Snoosford Hall. Allegedly, a gleaming estate with modern privies and at least one working drawbridge. Imagine their mutual disappointment when they arrived, exhausted and damp, to discover not a manor, but a sloping lump occupied almost entirely by sheep. Ah, yes, the sheep. Dozens of them, possibly hundreds, blinking with mild disapproval and chewing grass at a pace that suggested both judgment and digestion. Neither army wished to proceed, not because of fear, but because of feet. You see, the drizzle of the night before had turned Snoosford into a most magnificent soup, a soggy cauldron of squelch and slump, where boots went to die and socks wept softly in the dark. In one particularly heroic attempt to charge up the hill, Sergeant Albus Higgleby sank to his waist in what would later be described in military logs as a bog of enduring consequence. He was recovered 3 days later, mildly pickled, but otherwise charming. It was around that squishy hour, maybe just before second breakfast, when both commanders, peering from their damped-down tents, decided, separately but simultaneously, that actual combat was quite beneath them. Lord Snodgrass summoned his voice herald and dictated a notice that read something like, "To the noble Lady Butterweight, I regret to inform you that due to sudden and vigorous dampness, today's engagement must be postponed indefinitely. Kindly do not approach, as my feet make sounds I do not trust." Lady Butterweight, being of similarly practical constitution, replied in polished cursive, "To Lord Snodgrass, we accept your honourable postponement. We too have discovered the ground to be not so much a field as it is a dreamless pudding. May your leggings dry swiftly. No shots fired, no flags trampled, just two respectable camps, each claiming moral victory while wringing out their underthings and feeding slightly too soft biscuits to every available sheep. And the sheep? They watched, silently, judging, always chewing. Local legend claims one of the sheep, a sullen-eyed ram named Basil, was awarded the honorary rank of Baron by Lady Butterweight after he refused to move for passing cavalry. His medal, a slightly curved carrot tied to his neck with twine and passive aggression. Oh, the scrolls may not remember this day. No grand statues erected, no songs sung under heraldic moons. But somewhere, in the squish memoirs of military manuals long out of print, the soak standoff of Snoozeford survives as a testament to what can happen when ambition meets unrelenting drizzle. Nothing. And it was glorious. Now rest a bit, weary listener. The rain outside may still be falling, gently now, like the applause of very tiny clouds. But we have much more snoozy strategy to meander through. Soon, we'll drift toward a nearby village with a bakery that influences military morale far more than any general speech ever could. As the clouds puffed with pride and the drizzle composed its nightly lullaby, the battlefield remained stubbornly uninterested in proceedings. It was now day 3 of what some optimists were still calling the skirmish with potential, though even the pigeons watching from the soggy rooftops had begun losing interest. The rain had not stopped. Not once. Not even for a hopeful 10 minutes of dramatic galloping. No thunderbolts, mind you. No heroic silhouettes rearing on wet hilltops. Just the occasional sneeze, followed by half-hearted apologies muffled through soggy mustaches. And yet, something stirred in the west. Enter the cavalry of straw hats. Now, I should clarify. These weren't warriors made of straw, nor were they connected in any way to farmers or that particular scarecrow lobby of the 1700s. This was the nickname given, somewhat generously, to a largely unused unit of mounted soldiers who wore exceptionally large, floppy straw hats in defiance of regulation headgear. The hats were initially intended as a misguided experiment in morale boosting, a literal brightness of spirit project introduced by a well-meaning quartermaster with a penchant for fashion trends and sun safety. And though the sun hadn't made an appearance since Tuesday, the hats remained firmly tied under dripping chins, acting less like helmets and more like miniature sun umbrellas suffering from seasonal depression. Their role in this soggy standoff, thus far mainly decorative. Lance practice had been postponed repeatedly due to the horses wanting absolutely no part of the bog that had once been a meadow. In fact, if you happened to be downwind, you could hear the horses muttering their discomfort in long, grassy snorts. One particularly insistent mare named Gertrude had taken to refusing movement entirely, opting instead to lean against a rain barrel and reflect morosely on her career choices. Yet today, the straw cavalry was determined. By dawn's damp light, they had assembled with quiet rustling and the squish of many spurs in mud. 31 horses, 19 of which had immediately sat down. Of the remaining dozen, half meandered to nibble on wet clover, perhaps mistaking it for early retirement. Their commander, Lord Ponsby Fitzbleet of Lower Hatshire, gave a rousing speech nearly no one heard, as it was delivered through a mouthful of biscuit that had become so damp it sounded like a diplomatic treaty between two teapots. Still, his point was made. Possibly, the cavalry would ride forth today toward a hill or a tree line, or perhaps just adjacent to the enemy, assuming anyone could determine where that enemy was through the ever-thickening mist. But before action, refreshments. This proved to be the moment of unintended brilliance. Wading through puddles like dejected flamingos, the straw cavalry passed a small orchard and stopped for impromptu cider. Not realizing the barrels were mildly fermented, the horses became notably buoyant in spirit. With snorts of merriment and renewed enthusiasm, 3 of them began pirouetting. Gertrude, for the first time in days, got up. She even kicked a slipper into the fog. Somewhere a bugle meant to signal a charge let out a wheezy rendition of "God Save the What Was That Sound." Then, for exactly 27 seconds, the cavalry moved. It was not a charge per se, more of an elegant shuffle, a gliding of hooves mixed with unintended slides, as loose mud turned their advance into a kind of ballet meets landslide event. Hats flopped, horses chuckled. One soldier attempted to draw his saber, only to withdraw instead an entire sandwich he'd stored beneath his belt. Chicken and mustard, if you must know. The enemy, unmoved, mostly because they were not expected to arrive until Thursday, and so the straw cavalry's movement ended as it began, with a minor splash and general confusion. They returned to base, now closer to where they started than when they began. A small victory in that no one was injured and 2 sandwiches were recovered relatively dry. That evening, back in camp, the soldiers dried their straw hats near small fires and listened to the creaking of trees as rain tapped the tent roofs softly. Someone suggested they rename themselves the Drizzle Dragoons. The idea was met with polite laughter and one emphatic neigh. Outside, the clouds whispered among themselves, plotting more droplets for the morning. Inside their tents, men and horses alike slipped slowly towards sleep, wrapped in the damp glow of a battle allegedly in progress. And just as the last hat was set gently on a wooden post to dry overnight, something unusual rustled beyond the hedgerow, a sound that wasn't rain. A twig, a whisper, a footstep. But that, dear sleeper, is a gentle thread we'll tug on next time. Good evening again, dear listener. Or rather, good mid-evening, quiet mid-thunderstorm, sheep counting, hour. Wherever you happen to be, under quilts, nestled in a warm corner of the night, or floating somewhere between awareness and dream, tonight we find ourselves squelching gently into a curious moment in our sleepy saga. Military footwear and deep, historical regret. The year is still 1788. The place remains charmingly awful. The Austrian border town of Karansebes, which hadn't seen much drama since someone miscounted cabbages at the market a few months earlier. But now, the air is thick with misunderstanding. And rain. Always the rain. Even the clouds seem bored. Now, one might assume that before a battle, even one as imaginary and accidentally tragic as this, soldiers would at least be issued functional shoes. But no, dear dreamer. The Habsburg army, known for their splendid mustaches and bewildering bureaucracy, had instead developed a kind of boot that could resist neither water nor logic. These boots, stiff leather monstrosities, were so impractical that many soldiers removed them altogether, choosing instead to march in wet socks or barefoot through the sloshy marshes. And here's the historical cherry on top of this soggy Sunday. Due to supply mix-ups, some regiments received left boots, only left boots. A battalion of lefties in every sense of the word. It is estimated, by absolutely no one reputable, that morale declined by roughly 17% as a result. Now imagine, under a dim, rain-swollen moon, the sounds of an army on the move, the squish of 60,000 wet feet, the rustle of saturated wool, and the occasional multilingual complaint. Austrian, Croatian, Wallachian, Italian. all muttering the universal soldier's phrase, "Whose idea was this?" Add to that a touch of thunder. Not the poetic kind, just the sort that feels like heavy furniture being dragged across a celestial hall. And then, of course, the groan of wet cannons being moved by horses who had long since ceased caring. The horses, by the way, were miserable. Their harnesses were chafed, their oats were soggy, and they too lacked adequate footwear. They joined the ranks of battlefield grumblers, occasionally letting out a disgruntled snort as if to say, "This is not Napoleon worthy." And yet, amidst this puddle-born pessimism, something endearingly hilarious unfolded. A patrol of soldiers, likely from the edge of the Austrian vanguard, stumbled across something incredible. Not a tactical position, nor a fort, nor even a dry rock to sit on. No, they found a group of camp followers and civilian merchants selling schnapps from wooden carts under leaky tarps. A miracle had descended from the heavens, and it smelled faintly of plums. Naturally, and understandably, a small coin jar and some light bargaining led to what can only be described as pre-battle morale enhancement. Soldiers, weary, sloshed, and yearning for a warm belly, engaged in one of history's oldest tactical maneuvers, drinking someone else's schnapps without telling the officer in charge. Word spread, like wildfire, only wetter. Soon, other troops began sneaking their way toward the makeshift bar to partake. Some offered musket balls as payment, others compliments in broken German. A few simply loomed menacingly. And thus began the great military misunderstanding of the night. You see, not all the soldiers spoke the same language, and in the gentle fog of inebriation, someone thought someone else was actually the enemy, that someone reached for their sword with all the fluid coordination of a man in 2 left boots, tripped over a sleeping goat, and knocked over a lantern. Horses startled, soldiers yelled, and someone elsewhere in the dark cried, "Turks!" Except, of course, there were no Turks. Just Austrians attacking Austrians, slipping in the mud, shouting at each other in 6 dialects, while a confused schnapps merchant tried to rescue his tip jar. And so, under the dripping trees of a sleepy October night, began one of history's most directionless military actions. Could you even call it a battle? Possibly not. It was more of an interpretive war exercise, choreographed by chance, fueled by fruit brandy, and enacted by men who had forgotten their socks. But that's a tale for another moonlit chapter. For now, let the rain soothe the confusion, and the sound of marsh boots fade into stillness as we drift gently sideways into what followed when morning finally dared to arrive. As dawn tiptoed over the soggy horizon, casting a pale yawn of light across the endlessly damp tents of both armies, life in the most boring battlefield in the world carried on with all the drama of a mildly disorganized picnic. The rain, ever committed to its role, continued to mutter against canvas and soggy boot soles, like an old uncle telling winded stories about the Crimean War, thorough, relentless, and entirely unrelated to the present moment. In the heart of the command tent, General Fitzwilloughby Chalfont Hargrave III, whose name was longer than his battle record, was embroiled in a noble struggle of his own. Not with enemy cavalry or cannon fire, of course. No, General Fitz, as even the pigeons called him, was battling bureaucracy. You see, 18th century armies, when not flinging musket balls near other people's heads, were astonishingly good at paperwork. Orders had to be inked in triplicate, signed by the appropriate superior, countersigned by someone slightly less important, then sealed with wax that somehow always disappeared during thunderstorms. The forms were then filed in wooden folders that would later be used to start a cooking fire, because that's how regulations burned brightest. Today's excitement centered around the Quartermaster Request Form Omega 47B, a document required for the distribution of new socks. The Army's only dry pair had been accidentally assigned to the regimental goat during the last inventory. A grave morale issue, as soggy wool socks were, currently more controversial than the Duke of Wexley's 5-hour speeches on supply chain efficiency. "I simply don't see why our men can't requisition gear directly," sighed Major Thistlewhip, peering at the form sideways as though it might divulge its secrets if cornered. "Because," drawled General Fitz, stirring his tea with a spoon stolen from the French in '79, "direct requisition leads to chaos. First they take socks, then spoons, and suddenly the Royal Army has no silver nor shins to stand on. This form protects civilization, Major." It was then that the tent flap opened with the meager energy of a damp curtain, and Ensign Bartholomew Pete entered, mud up to his waist, and a look in his eyes that said he'd just had a meaningful conversation with a particularly aggressive puddle. "Sir," he reported, snapping a vaguely wet salute, "the enemy have completed their latrine trench." "Ah," General Fitz exhaled. "Progress, at last." Indeed, across the bogged battlefield, the opposing army, an equally unmotivated force led by General Leclerc, a man famous for his nap-honed strategy, had finally managed to complete a trench of stunning mediocrity. It was neither deep enough to drain properly, nor high enough to inspire awe. It simply existed, like a book with all its pages unstirring in the wind. Military observers, scribbling thick notes in drizzle-warped journals, declared it a soldier's trench, which in battlefield parlance meant better than nothing and worse than everything. But there was more somber news. The courier pigeon, Lord Feathersby, had returned from his secret mission, back feathers askew, an eye twitching from overexposure to bureaucratic Latin. His note read, "Council denies additional umbrellas. Suggest knitting new ones from wool. No wool available. Refer to chart F22 for approved alternatives." "So," said Major Thistlewhip, stretching stiffly, "the men will remain soggy and umbrella-less. We could try hope as a material, or perhaps dry toast." "Hope," replied General Fitz, "is not waterproof, and toast molds in this climate." Outside, soldiers in both camps had taken to building small collaborative shelters during ceasefires. Temporary peace huts, they called them. Makeshift lean-tos where French and British troops drank tepid coffee and compared whose rations were more beige. The clear winner was the British hardtack, which could chip teeth at 15 paces and once defected to the enemy on ethical grounds. Still, the rain fell, and as each drop traced its slow path down flapping tent walls, time itself seemed to exhale. The war lingered like a tea left steeping too long, bitter, undirected, and vaguely tannic. And so, forms were filled, socks remained an abstract concept, and history trudged softly onward. Somewhere, in a damp corner of the world, two armies waited for motivation, for orders, or for a dry Tuesday. And across the field, under a flax blue tarp that sagged gently in the middle, a peculiar stirring began. Not of battle, but of baking. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another curl of rain, and another chapter. As the third day of rain arrived, dripping softly into the damp collars of history's most uninspired soldiers, the battlefield of Frog's Bottom Ridge had begun to resemble a particularly unpleasant porridge. Not the warm cinnamon kind, mind you, but the unfortunate grey sludge that gathers near drains and carries the scent of sopping wool and confused ambition. The commanders, both equally undecided about the purpose of the war, were engaged in their own little drama. A siege that wasn't quite a siege, around a hill that wasn't quite a hill, led by armies that didn't quite want to be there. Marshal Reginald Cabbage of the Westward Trousers was, by all accounts, a man of action, but only action that could be undertaken indoors. By day 3, with his boots squelching and his moustache collecting dew like a reluctant fern, he decided to declare a siege on the eastward waistband's muddy encampment. He sent a letter to General Thistlewit, tied to a damp duck rather than a carrier pigeon, as all the pigeons were on strike due to unreasonable working conditions, chiefly the rain and general indignity of being carriers in such an undignified war. The letter read, "To the esteemed General Thistlewit, we are encircling your position, or at least thinking about it when the wind is right. Kindly consider yourselves besieged and behave accordingly. Yours moisture-bound, Monsieur Reginald C." It took the duck 2 days to make the short journey. It kept stopping to rest in puddles and make small talk with frogs. By the time the letter had arrived, Thistlewit had already assumed they were under siege, not because of any abrupt movement by the enemy, but because the army cook, Agnes, had run out of salt, and supplies weren't expected until after the seasonal molasses races in the neighbouring village of Dobbleshire on the Wade. As evenings passed, the so-called siege settled into a pattern that could only be described as half-hearted loitering. Every few hours, a drummer would perform the dullest march known to military bands, a steady 4-beat that sounded more like someone slowly folding an umbrella than any call to arms. Soldiers from both sides often wandered off after it began, wrongly assuming it meant biscuit time. Daily hostilities involved passive-aggressive semaphore, carried out with increasingly soggy flags. The Westerners' signallers spelled out, "We shall cut off your access to enthusiasm," while the Easterners replied, "We already did that to ourselves, thanks." There were no assaults, there were no sallies, just an increasingly intricate series of trench embroidery contests and philosophical debates about whether time was actually passing, or just looping in different shades of grey. Still, morale was surprisingly intact, if subdued, thanks to Chaplain Buttergill, who began offering nightly, muffled psalm and crumpet services under his waterproof canvas chapel. It was just a hat, really, but he stood under it with conviction. His sermons included gentle reflections on the Book of Numbers, mostly the parts where everyone wandered around and nothing really happened. The only skirmish worth noting that week occurred not between enemies, but between rival knitting circles. The Western 3rd Regiment's circle accused the Eastern 9th of yarn espionage, claiming an unauthorized stitch had found its way into their sock pattern. A brief standoff occurred behind the latrines, culminating in a strongly worded limerick and 3 slightly bruised egos. Meanwhile, intelligence reports filtered in from civilian observers, largely weather-worn sheep, who had wandered onto the field. Their notes, scrawled by shepherds on bits of dry bark, confirmed that both sides remained exactly where they were, achieving roughly the same amount of tactical advancement as a sleepwalking snail on roller skates. And still, the rain fell, soft, insistent, utterly impartial. The earth beneath the troops had turned to custard, and the sky had become a grey duvet pulled snug over the entire countryside. Records note that by this point, 1 in 4 soldiers had begun talking in their sleep, mostly about toast. So as night settled once more on the gradually stewing marsh of inaction, the 2 mighty forces of the Waistband War remained thoroughly ensnared, not by battle, but by the sheer inertia of damp trousers and mutual apathy. But somewhere, somehow, a change was brewing. Perhaps in the puddled prints of a boot that didn't belong. Or perhaps in the distant sound of gurgling bagpipes carried on the wind, announcing a guest neither side had invited. Whatever it was, it quietly loomed like unexpected gravy on a vanilla pudding. We'll venture into that soggy surprise. Very soon, it was a cold, clingy sort of morning. The kind that wraps around your ankles like a soggy kitten and doesn't let go. Somewhere in the dew-drenched hills, men in slightly mud-spattered uniforms stood in long, patient lines, looking at each other as if to say, "Well, here we are again." By now, the battle had dragged on longer than the knitting of a royal tea cozy. What had started with shouts and trumpets had settled into a daily routine of listless formations, dignified boredom, and the soft squelch of boots in wet fields, a sort of soggy stalemate. Now, you might be wondering, in a prudent whisper, what do two armies do when neither really wishes to attack? It keeps raining like a melodramatic cloud opera, and the local sheep have shown more tactical initiative than the generals. The answer, dear dreamer, is drill. Endless, fabulous circular drill. Colonel Bellwether, he of the ornamental moustache and secretary-like handwriting, had recently instituted a new regulation requiring the troops to practice changing formations every quarter hour, just to keep discipline sharp and everyone looking increasingly confused. And so, each morning, bugles moaned their sleepy calls, and soldiers yawned themselves into precise little rectangles that rotated politely around the field like clock hands running slightly late. An observer from the Royal Academy of Unnecessary Observations noted, "Their maneuverability is second only to their disinterest." There were lines, then columns, then lines again. Files became ranks, and ranks became queues for the breakfast tent. The drummers marched forward, then backward, then sideways by accident. Once, a whole regiment reformed into the shape of an accidentally obscene fruit bowl, an error that took 37 minutes to correct and caused mild scandal in the nearby convent. On the other side of the marshy meadow, the opposing troops were not to be outdone. General von Niblick, who had once published a 37-page essay on the optimal angle of helmet feathers, was convinced that a well-drilled army was the mark of divine favor. Unlike Colonel Bellwether, General von Niblick embraced more ceremonial flourishes. His men practiced synchronized sneezing to keep spirits up. He had also personally overseen the development of the first known marching waltz, a mode of progress that combined pitiful speed with impeccable footwork. Waltzing into battle, however, proved more hazardous during mud season. On more than one occasion, an entire platoon wobbled dreamily across the meadow, only to pivot straight into a haystack and remain politely stuck until the evening goose census. Now, military historians, those tireless chroniclers of decisive nothingness, have often puzzled over this week of parade phase hostilities, as it came to be known. No shots were fired. Not a scuffle disturbed the calm, except one spirited disagreement over the last piece of lemon pudding. The pudding, incidentally, had been cooling on the windowsill of the army cook, Mrs. Plumley, whose desserts were said to contain at least as much gunpowder as flavour. After someone, likely Private Mudd, known pudding thief and amateur poet, snuck off with the final spoonful, a formal inquiry was submitted in cursive. In a stunning display of procedural thoroughness, both armies agreed to cease practicing maneuvers for one day to convene a bilateral pudding conference. Independent mediators were brought in from the village, including the vicar, a rather stern goat named Gertrude, and Ernest, the shoemaker's boy, who once correctly identified the flavor of saffron with his eyes closed. After 6 hours of gentle debate, the pudding was declared evaporated by destiny. Order was slowly restored, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the soldiers went to bed without having learned a single new way to stand in a triangle. Did anything of tactical value result from this great concert of inaction? No. But the men learned to pirouette in full kit. Evenings were quiet and contemplative. Around their little fires, soaked socks steaming gently in the heat, soldiers told stories about puddles so deep they had names, and drills so elaborate they needed choreographers. There was laughter, not uproarious, but the kind that starts in the nostrils and ends somewhere near the belly button. It rained again that night, gently as whispers. The field gleamed under moonlight, 1,000 small puddles reflecting the stars like tiny sleepy eyes. And just beyond the hedgerow, something new began to rustle. A surprise, coming not from the high command, but from a certain duck with impeccable timing, and perhaps questionable allegiance. But that, my dear listener, is a dream for another evening. By the time the rain had soaked its way into even the stoutest of boot seams, both sides in the world's most uneventful military encounter had unintentionally stumbled into a new kind of warfare. One fought not with swords or cannons, but stationary. You see, the rainy hills that hosted this gloriously uneventful conflict made actual fighting a soggy impossibility, so the officers, who were generally more fond of desks than duels, took to communicating through an unrelenting stream of correspondence. Oh yes, letters, endless letters, polite missives penned by candlelight on damp parchment, folded with great care, sealed with wax that never quite dried in the moisture-slicked tents, and delivered by equally damp messengers who were starting to take things very, very personally. So let's set the scene. It is precisely 12 minutes past noon, and despite their valiant efforts, both armies have taken only one casualty all week. A soldier named Horace, who slipped on a roasted turnip and bruised everything except his pride. The generals, seeing the continued restlessness among their troops and their own growing boredom, decide to revive the grand, ancient art of military diplomacy. General Witherington, commander of the northern side and longtime collector of antique teaspoons, carefully penned a letter to his southern counterpart requesting a ceasefire, not because there was any fire to cease, mind you, but to allow time to dry the trousers and spirits of all parties involved. On the southern side, General Claude Duvet, descended from a long line of French-English herbalists and amateur ghost hunters, received the letter with the seriousness of a philosopher receiving a prophecy. Unfortunately, he'd never been able to read Witherington's handwriting. A chicken attempting calligraphy in a wind tunnel would have done better. So Duvet replied with what he assumed was suitable gravitas. Dearest General Witherling, while your recent note arrived splotched, soggy, and slightly scented of onions, your message of damp resignation, I think, has been met with an equal measure of melancholic mirth. I do concur. Our boots are fit for the bin, our morale dampened to a pulp, and my lieutenant has developed an allergy to wet canvas. Proceed accordingly, pending approval from the camp's resident badger, Sir Muffins. Sir Muffins was of course imaginary, a fiction born of damp delirium and Duvet's fondness for storytelling after too many rain-infused rations. But Witherington, taking the appearance of this new advisor quite seriously, replied at once, To General Duvet and Sir Muffins, I appreciate your whimsical engagement in these sodden talks. While I regret to inform you we have no badger to match your merry diplomat, we do possess an owl who hoots exclusively at sunset and appears to favor boiled cabbage. The owl has, in a wholly unprecedented gesture, blinked thrice in support of your terms. Let us move toward mutual inaction post-haste. And so, treaties were nearly formed, broken over misunderstandings involving root vegetables, and reformed again with more decorative poetic flair. The letters, carefully delivered by runners wading through knee-deep mud and existential despair, began piling up in camp. No one could remember which agreements were binding and which were birthday wishes misfiled by accident. Illiterate soldiers passed time pretending to read the notes aloud, adding dramatic falsetto and plot twists involving love triangles, missing inheritances, and in one memorable case, a duck that sought revenge on a wheel of cheese. The letters, in this odd way, became entertainment, the wet theatre of polite procrastination. One soldier, Alfie, even began giving nightly public readings of the most recent diplomatic dispatches, performed by lantern light in a leaky corner of the barracks. Troops from both sides gathered, shivering together, to hear such genital prose as, "My dearest duvet, the pile of waterlogged onions delivered to our barricade was both confusing and bittersweet. We suspect they were either a threat or a salad. Kindly clarify." Eventually, the epistolary flood exceeded the rainfall. Parchment strewn about battlefield paths peeled and disintegrated underfoot. Trees sprouted with notes pinned to their bark like poorly organized laundry. And in a testament to just how terribly exciting nothing can be, new recruits arriving at camp assumed the war was fought with paper. No one quite recalled what mattered anymore. And yet, in this absurd dance of ink and rain, a peculiar peace began to settle, like two old dogs growling from opposite porches, only because they've forgotten how not to. Somewhere in the early twilight, as the sky wept gently overhead and boots were wrung out like dishcloths, those letters fluttered on the breeze, confused, charming, and entirely unread, much like the war itself. And just as one particularly eloquent scroll floated into a puddle, its wax seal dissolving into a curiously artistic swirl, a new sound echoed across the field. A trumpet. But not the summoning sort. The sort that comes from someone who had beans for lunch. But never mind that. Let's quietly tiptoe into the next whisper of our watery war, where music, of all things, will try to rouse the damp. At precisely dawnish, give or take an hour and a half, because nobody really wanted to check, our story's damp collection of underpaid soldiers and over-papery generals awoke to another thrillingly uneventful morning. Not from the stirring of martial fanfare, nor the cry of ravens echoing over a battlefield, but from a squelch. Yes, the great squelch of 1704. A sound historians have poetically described as thick pudding meeting military boot. If you're imagining half a battalion slowly losing their footwear to a moody countryside clay pit, you're halfway to enlightenment. Now, as you drift deeper into this particularly plodding portion of our tale, inhale deeply, through your imagination of course, and you might smell the delicate bouquet of wet wool socks, horse breath, and something vaguely pickled. The scent of 18th century warfare before a single musket is fired. Let us turn our attention to the quartermasters, those unsung heroes of nothing happening. Picture, if you will, a modest canvas tent filled with scrolls, ledgers, quills, and two men arguing over whether 37 barrels of hardtack were, in fact, delivered or merely imagined into the inventory by wishful thinking. The truth was, and this may shock you, they had run out of pencils but not arguments. One such quartermaster, Sir Reginald Plumwater Smythe, A man whose most daring battlefield feat was spelling coagulated correctly in cursive spent this morning trying to requisition more rope. Why, you ask? Because the horses had discovered that chewing through rope was more entertaining than listening to any of the sermons delivered by Chaplain Blunderthatch, who only knew one volume, Sombre Bellow. Reginald's requisition attempt went something like this. Quartermaster's assistant. Sir, we haven't any rope, not since the sog took the last shipment. Reginald. Then send for string. Assistant. Sir, the string's being used to tie the sausages. Reginald, with indignation. On whose authority are sausages given access to string? Assistant. On the authority of hunger, sir. And so, the rope problem remained unresolved, like most things in this war of inaction. But logistics did not end with string and sausages. No, there was also the matter of laundry, a subject dear to any soldier with at least one functioning nostril. Laundry during wartime was not a high priority, which may explain the sour but oddly comforting funk wafting over the stagnant river. One soldier, Private Fennel Thosselbatch, attempted to wash his uniform in the stream, unaware that upstream, a donkey had taken up residence in a capsized laundry tub and now professed territorial rights to the entire bend. The ensuing confrontation is notable, mostly because it involved exactly no violence, but an alarming number of meaningful glances between species. We must take a moment to mention the ceremonial cannon, affectionately referred to as Old Sneezer. It had not fired since the spring of '03, mostly because they'd misplaced the cannonballs, then used the fuse cord to knit a rather charming tea cozy for someone's mother. Fun fact, Old Sneezer was repurposed to hold onions during the rainy season, and thus time passed, as it tends to do in sog-drenched encampments, slowly, soggily, and with a vague yearning for dry bread and affection. By mid-afternoon, a period marked not by any bell or watch, but by the third complaint about feet mildew, the entire command was consumed with organizing the water barrel seating chart. You see, they only had 5 dry spots and 6 officers who insisted on not sharing. Chaos, as ever, was politely averted by someone offering brandy boiled with cloves, which instantly knocked out 2 of the 6. Solved. Peaceful. Warm. And as the clouds huddled once again for their scheduled drizzle, the camp settled into the same quiet they'd started the day with. A hush broken only by the sound of a distant goat attempting to speak fluent French. It was unclear whether the goat had succeeded. And so concludes this chapter of gentle disarray, where the war might not be won or lost, but the laundry definitely isn't dry. If you've made it this far, well done, dear listener. Stretch those toes under your blanket. Breathe in imaginary, cannon onion tea steam, and drift softly onward. For ahead lies a matter of boots, too many boots, and not a left one in sight. As another drizzle painted teardrops across the canvas of grey clouds overhead, Major General Archibald Soggy Boots, Pembroke, stood at the edge of what could only loosely be defined as a battlefield, and more accurately described as a very disappointed sheep pasture. His hat, once a proud bicorn adorned with a feather nobler than the dreams of Bacon, drooped like a plucked lily, saturated to its core. Now, General Pembroke was not particularly fond of war. In fact, he believed that most conflicts could be resolved over a strong pot of oolong and perhaps a well-prepared mushroom tart. But unfortunately, protocol dictated he wear polished boots, issue commanding squints, and stand sternly in the rain while being stared at by cows who clearly knew better. The year was 1808. The place was some corner of the Iberian Peninsula even the locals had stopped naming, and the battle at hand was optional. Seriously, neither side was particularly enthusiastic that morning. A rather alarming number of soldiers had forgotten to load their muskets. One group tripped over a puddle so large it had acquired legal citizenship as a lake. The opposing general, Don Alfonso de las Zapatillas Mojadas, was a man of high philosophy and lower back pain, known to quote Aristotle while swatting away mosquitoes. Don Alfonso was, at that very moment, warming his socks over a tepid fire and wondering aloud if perhaps existence itself was just a dream within a dream, and one that badly needed dry laundry. Back to Pembroke, who had just received a courier, a very small, very wet drummer boy named Tibbins. "Message for the General, sir," Tibbins peeped, handing over a moderately soaked note. Pembroke unfurled the parchment with the delicacy of a man peeling a banana without getting his hands dirty. The ink had run away like startled geese. All that remained was a loop from a Y and something that may have once resembled an exclamation mark, now merely a soggy frown. "Well, that clears that up," Pembroke said quietly, tucking the unintelligible message into the folds of his coat with the ceremonial gravity of someone folding a dinner napkin in an empty room. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Snodgrass, a man whose moustache had ambitions of its own, approached with dual cups of earthenware tea. The tea, naturally, was lukewarm and tasted faintly of despair and old cannon grease. But in that moment, with the winds howling gently like disappointed librarians and the horizon fading into watercolor smudges of mist, it was perfection. "Remind me, Lieutenant," Pembroke asked, sipping carefully. "What precisely are we fighting over again?" Snodgrass consulted a soggy schedule. "Looks to be a town, sir. One with 3 donkey carts, a bread oven and a battalion of goats. Strategic importance, negligible. Moral importance also negligible." "Ah, splendid," said the general, smiling thinly. "Would be a shame to lose it." Behind them, 2 artillerymen were playing cards with their cannons. Not next to them, with them. The cannons, named Petunia and Harold respectively, were dressed in makeshift shawls to keep the damp at bay. The soldiers insisted they fired better when swaddled. By late afternoon, a mutual decision emerged across both lines, endorsed by Pembroke and Don Alfonso independently and with no formal meeting. The battle would be postponed on account of everything: weather, general disinterest, and several officers' allergies acting up. A ceasefire cannon boomed lazily, startling a hedge. As the sun considered showing up to the horizon, and then remembered it was on strike for better working conditions, mostly dry ones, General Pembroke stood alone near a puddle that mirrored his soggy reflection. He adjusted his hat, which flopped like a lazy seal, sighed softly, and whispered almost affectionately, "Well, at least no one died, except for morale. That's been lying face down since breakfast." A star blinked above the mist. Even it seemed sleepy, and Pembroke turned toward his tent, where dry socks and poorly tuned bagpipes waited in equal measure. On the opposing hill, somewhere in a foggy field of stubborn cabbages, Don Alfonso was preparing an evening lecture on the futility of footwear. And nestled in between drizzle and dusk, as the battlefield quietly returned to sheep and silence, tomorrow tiptoed forward with mud on its boots and a new misunderstanding in its satchel. And dreams, like old coats, would be tried on again under a different sky. Next, we'll drift toward an encounter so politely uneventful, it was adjudicated by yawns. Before we drift too far from your pillow and into the soggy fields of semi-forgotten military history, Let's gently set our woolen boots on the damp grass of Northern Europe in the early 18th century, a time when uniforms were heavier than common sense, and most battles took longer than the average bread to rise. We arrive at the Siege of Stralsund, during the most contemplative chapter of the Great Northern War, a conflict so long and rain-soaked it felt less like a war and more like a very stern weather pattern with intermittent swordplay. Stralsund, a modest coastal city with strong walls and stronger winds, was the site of a siege so unhurried you'd wonder if anyone really wanted to win. The city was a Swedish stronghold, bravely squatting on the Baltic coast like a stubborn cat in a flower box, while several Prussian, Danish, and Saxon commanders peered over their maps and decided to take it, eventually. Our sleepy hero today, none other than King Charles V of Sweden, the famously intense monarch who treated wars like chess and chess like battles. By the time this siege began in 1711, the king had already been worn down by years of marching, charging, and probably not changing his socks. He'd lost most of his army, but never his irrational confidence. Charles V was not one for comfort. Deeply committed to personal austerity, he famously slept on the floor, which may explain both his back pain and his temperament. During the siege, he directed defences with grim intensity from the city walls, cloak soaked through with rain and face set like a frowning statue. Rain, you ask? Oh yes, all the rain. The skies during the siege of Stralsund behaved like an emotionally repressed poet, eternally grey, softly sobbing. Trenches turned into puddles, and puddles into performance art. Cannons had to be covered with oiled cloth just to keep them from rusting shut. One Danish general reportedly gave up after sinking into a mud trench and losing a boot that was never recovered. Legend has it the boot earned its own pension. While the opposing armies built siege works at a pace best described as procrastinatory, the defenders found time for equally sluggish pursuits. Among the more legendary pastimes, attempting to boil water. The wind off the Baltic coast whipped so furiously around the city that open flames danced spasmodically and kettles trembled like anxious debutantes. Soldiers took shifts wind-blocking the cook fires just so they could make tea strong enough to taste like something other than regret. Amid these damp affairs, diplomats from all sides floated letters back and forth so slowly that by the time an offer reached its destination, it was usually irrelevant. One truce proposal reportedly arrived months late, drafted in ink that had run into a soft watercolor of apology. Yet, Stralsund stood, or rather, sagged defiantly. Its rampart sagged under the weight of sandbags and melancholy. Some soldiers, driven by boredom more than bravery, mounted surprise sallies against the besiegers, mostly in search of fresh bread or slightly less soggy boots. Inside the city, Charles V refused to retreat. When asked by subordinates whether they should consider the distant possibility of surrender, he allegedly responded with a stare so long and so cold that even the rats paused to reconsider their allegiances. And yet, the siege didn't end with glory or drama. Like a slow nap before dinner, it drifted toward a conclusion without really deciding to finish. In 1715, after years of drizzle and dwindling supplies, the city did fall, but Charles, in true dramatic form, escaped by ship, wearing not armour, but what witnesses described as a very fine blue coat entirely inappropriate for sailing. And so, the siege closed like a soggy book left on a windowsill, pages warped, plot unresolved, but oddly calming. No thunderous charges, no decisive victory, just endless clouds, lukewarm tea, and the kind of damp trousers that test a man's convictions. As the last lanterns flicker on the walls of Stralsund, and the drizzle dials down to drizzle's dimmer cousin, let us now tiptoe toward a tent where muddy boots have been kicked off and cloaks hung out to drip. For beyond the walls of dampness, another remarkable moment tiptoes into history. Quietly, of course, because in this war, even excitement takes a nap first. By now, the rain had thoroughly moved in and unpacked its luggage. Sheets of drizzle hung draped across the sky, like nature's wet laundry. Puddles winked under the half-hearted sunlight, and everyone's socks, on both sides of the battlefield, had resigned themselves to permanent dampness. There's a unique kind of stillness that comes with a long rain. It hushes the birds, softens the trees, and in this case, turns an entire battlefield into the world's largest and least coordinated slip and slide. It was on such a morning that the soldiers, those ambitious, mud-bedraggled men of questionable strategy and exquisite moustaches, attempted a maneuver so uninspiring, it deserves a place of honor in the yawning hall of military anti-glory. The general in charge, let's call him Sir Dribbleton of Damshire, was not known for his aggressive tactics. In fact, he once famously delayed a cavalry charge because he feared the horses might catch colds. Sir Dribbleton believed in the power of patience, and also in waterproof bonnet linings. His battle strategy this morning was as follows: slowly inch forward, avoid large puddles, and don't make eye contact with the enemy unless absolutely necessary. This resulted in what historians have come to call the low-impact advance. Imagine dozens of men, boots squelching like overcooked squash, trudging forward in a sort of collective shrug. Each step was a negotiation between pride and practicality. The mud, as it often does, had other plans. Now, let us pause here to appreciate the mud. Not just any mud. This was noble mud, the kind that clung with commitment. If this mud had a motto, it might have been, "If you fall here, you stay here." It wasn't just wet dirt. It was an artist, sculpting boots into immovable monuments. It was a prankster, undoing buttons and swallowing tent pegs with equal enthusiasm. One soldier, Private Percival Thistlewhim, attempted to lead a daring sidestep maneuver, only to lose one boot to the bog forever. He limped nobly for the next 7 minutes, then gave up and declared a temporary sit-down protest against gravity. A nearby corporal thoughtfully fashioned him a galoche from discarded cabbage leaves and optimism. Meanwhile, the enemy, camped just on the other side of the hill of slight inconvenience, was facing similar struggles. Their commander, General Elbowthorpe, was too proud to admit his troops were similarly stuck. He told dispatch riders to retreat, but the dispatch riders couldn't move. One simply lay down like a dramatic Victorian poet and offered to become a landmark. And so it was that two entire armies stared at each other from a muddy distance, separated by a chasm not of ideology, but of increasingly sticky sludge. Reports indicate that in place of volleys of gunfire or artillery shells, the main sounds of this day were squishes, yelps, and the occasional flatulent gurgle of a soggy stew pot surrendering to the mire. One soldier mistook the mud for his bedroll and managed a 2-hour nap, only to awaken mildly fossilized. A low-ranking ensign named Hubert Marmalade made a valiant attempt to raise morale by playing a marching tune on his piccolo, but the melody was quickly drowned out by the slurp of his foot being eaten by turf. In any case, he only knew 2 songs. Both sounded like reluctant bagpipes, and still. Somehow, in the midst of all this minimal progress, there was a kind of peace. No one was charging, no one was shouting, just the rhythmic hum of rain on canvas, a chorus of grumbling stomachs, and the stately processional of soggy underwear being hung on musket barrels to dry. It is said one major attempted a surprise flanking maneuver by hopping sideways through the marsh, like an unusually determined heron. This flapdash gambit, as it was later called, succeeded only in alarming a nearby flock of geese and losing the major's trousers to an indignant thistle bush. And so, with dignity sinking steadily into the ground, the day dreamed on. The soldiers stood like damp statues of indecision, the mud up to their socks, and the hope of anything dramatic fading faster than a wet map. But something was stirring, not in the hearts of the men necessarily, but just over the ridge where the firewood pile had recently collapsed into an irreversible stew. A council was forming. A meeting of war-weary minds was scheduled for dusk, and their proposals, dear listener, would soon shift the very tides of boredom. But for now, rest easy. The battle remains unbothered, unbloodied, and blissfully stuck. Curl closer to the warmth and let your mind wander toward the distant campfire where Chapter 16 slowly begins to crackle to life. The morning after the non-booming, near-silent debacle of the battlefield arrived with a whisper rather than a bang. The clouds, as indecisive as ever, hung low like overfed sheep auditioning for a local production of The Tempest. And although not a single soul had perished in combat, because you see, no real combat had actually occurred, morale was still somehow dripping. Enter the diplomats. Now, if you've never seen a diplomat wander onto a battlefield, where not a single arrow has flown, nor sword been unsheathed, you are missing a peculiar kind of performance art, equal parts theatre, bureaucracy, and slightly damp parchment. The delegation from the Kingdom of Mudlington arrived first, their robes trailing behind them like fabric trying to remember a drier yesterday. They were led by Lord Elmsley Featherwort IV, a man gifted in the ancient art of squinting over scrolls and saying things like, well, technically. He had the kind of face that looked like it knew the exact number of clauses in a wheat trading treaty from 1473. He was greeted by Countess Brimstone of Fogshire, representing the Northern Alliance, who had made a name for herself in the Treaty of the 7 slightly misunderstood sheep transactions. Her shoes were made of precisely waterproofed wool felt, one of the few successful military technologies to emerge from that decade. The air was thick with silence, which is one of diplomacy's preferred mediums. You have to understand, in times of uncertainty, diplomats thrive like mushrooms, in moist conditions with minimal light and plenty of decomposing intent. Lord Featherwort cleared his throat, an action that echoed across the drizzly glen like a slightly embarrassed toad. Shall we admit, he began with distinguished ambivalence, that today's hostilities have seen better weather? Countess Brimstone tilted her head like a curious cat. Hostilities is a bold word, she replied, as a droplet slid off her nose. I believe the only aggression I witnessed was between my boot and that puddle with particularly assertive mud. At this, one of the scribe boys sneezed into his ink. Most unfortunate, but diplomatically neutral. Still, with protocol plodding quietly along, both parties knew the ultimate goal: to ink peace in a way that looked dignified from every angle. The problem was, nobody could figure out exactly what they were ceasing. No shots had been fired. No flags had been dishonored. No, goats had even switched sides. But that didn't matter. What mattered was appearances, and perhaps the tea afterward. The peace accord of Drizzle Hollow, as it would come to be known, was drafted in a tent that leaked ever so slightly on the corner of every key paragraph. The ink ran in poetic rivulets, turning key phrases like cease formal hostilities into cheese formless possibilities, which both parties found mysteriously agreeable. When all was said and sogged, the signatures were smudged, the wax seals partially dissolved, and the parchment adopted a charming crinkle that future historians, drowsily flipping through archives, would mistake for dramatic intent. In ceremonial tradition, they exchanged tokens of eternalish friendship. Muddlington offered a ceremonial ladle carved from swamp birch, symbolizing the stirring of unity, and Fogshire presented a pair of woolen mittens, vaguely embroidered with what might have once been a dove, though in such rainfall, it resembled either a fish or a cloud having a midlife crisis. The affair concluded not with a trumpet, but with a shared moment over watered-down elderflower cordial. Lord Featherwood toasted to peace in perpetuity and practical shoes, while Countess Brimstone nodded solemnly, knowing full well that practical shoes were indeed the backbone of any lasting treaty. And so, the most boring battle in the world ended not in bloodshed, nor valour, nor even a decent dramatic pause, but in peace, soggy, scribbled, and slightly unsure of itself. As the diplomats climbed into their padded carriages and the mist rolled back in like a shy curtain, the glen returned to its natural state of quiet, blessed inaction. The sheep didn't notice. They had more immediate concerns, and as the sun tried half-heartedly to leak through the clouds, casting a buttery sort of gloom, new plans were already being whispered, plans not of battle, but of shrinking scones, long staircases, and logistical confusion in the choir loft. Let's drift into that tale next, shall we? While generals like to imagine that wars are won by courage, cunning, and a dramatic gust of wind at just the right moment, history often begs to differ. It is not always the sword or the strategy, but rather the spoon and the supply wagon that trudge steadily, if unglamorously, toward victory or, at the very least, survival. And so, tonight in Chapter 17, we gently march not to the rhythm of drums, but to the soothing creak of wooden wheels and the oddly comforting rattle of tin ration boxes. Welcome to the logistical underbelly of the most boring battle in the world. Let us picture the scene. Early dawn, damp with dew, and the scent of overboiled cabbage. The clouds above remain faithful to their cause of continual drizzle, which is neither stormy nor sunny, but exists in that calm, grey middle place where socks always feel a bit damp and tempers never quite boil, but do gently simmer. In a secluded copse near the rear of the encampment, behind the mud-streaked latrines and the perpetually confused horse named Jeremy, stands the silent, noble quartermaster's tent. Its canvas sags slightly under the consistent weight of the rain, like an elderly librarian bent under the weight of overdue books no one asked for. Inside an unsung hero sits Quartermaster Hargleby, a man whose beard predated the fashion and whose eyes gleamed not with dreams of glory, but the joy of correctly labelled spreadsheets. Salt pork again, he murmured to himself dreamily, unrolling a parchment of inventory with the slow satisfaction of someone about to find that yes, the mustard tins are finally accounted for. Hargleby didn't fight with weapons. He fought with charcoal pencils, copious patience, and the eternal optimism that next week's shipment might, by some small miracle, contain at least one functioning can opener. Supplies, after all, were the marrow of any army. Soldiers could not march on empty stomachs, though many historians forget how often they were expected to do exactly that. Still, Hargleby took pride in his job. Coins may jingle in treasuries and medals may shine on chests, but it was he who made sure every soldier got exactly 8 ounces of weevil-free hardtack. Well, mostly weevil-free. Let's not overpromise. Outside his tent, the day's big event was underway, the Great Barrel Swap. It was precisely as exciting as it sounds. 2 barrels, one filled with vinegary pickles, the other with slightly less vinegary pickles, were being mistaken for one another for the 3rd time this week. Private Blim grunted as he rolled one along the mushy turf, whispering to it as if afraid of offending its brine. "You're the good one, yeah," he said. The barrel, being a barrel, declined to reply. Down near the edge of the supply lane, a group of soldiers loitered in anticipation of the weekly ration distribution. They stood like soggy fence posts, boots sinking slowly into the earth, discussing whether it was better to lick the salt off a herring and throw the fish away, or hold out and trade 2 for a crust of dry bread unburdened by scent. Corporal Winneberg, known for both his sideburns and his existential pessimism, mused aloud, "What if the war never ends, and we're all just ghosts doomed to shuffle around with beans until the sun forgets us?" "No beans," came the dull voice of Private Duckling, reading a freshly pinned notice. "Mistaken delivery. Got buttons instead. Edible. Only if you believe hard enough." Meanwhile, back in his tent, Hargleby sighed contentedly. He had managed to reconstruct a long-lost box of pepper flakes from 3 different parcels marked miscellaneous, unknown fragments, and maybe cumin. Oh, the joy of an accurately seasoned stew. A rare wartime luxury, almost sacred. Even in the midst of sogginess, monotony, and misplaced kegs of ale. And yes, those were still missing. He found solace in the quiet confidence that morning would bring the next shipment of waxed paper, and someone, somewhere, might learn the right end of a ladle. And so, as the rain gathered in gentle rivulets off the tent canvas, and the night deepened into a silvery soup of clouds and quiet, the army of the world's most boring battles slept with full bellies, of pickles and buttons possibly, and dry enough socks, if rotated hourly. All thanks to Quartermaster Hargleby, keeper of the beans, guardian of the crates, and defender of the morale provided by mild spices. Next, we'll drift toward the camp's musical division, not so much marching in tune as humming off-key lullabies, with a story barely thrilling enough to play on a wooden flute. Somewhere between the drowsy drizzle and the slightly soggy trench pudding, the battle had slowed to a crawl so lazy it would make a snail yawn. The 43rd Friday of the ongoing reign had arrived, and with it came a marvelous diplomatic catastrophe involving umbrellas. A showdown so monumentally meandering it deserves its own museum wing, made entirely of damp wool and unfulfilled ambition. Now, you might be wondering, umbrellas in war? And yes, dear listener, when a battle is as boring as this, you must hold on to any conflict you can find, even one involving waterlogged parasols and a deep-rooted disagreement over proper umbrella etiquette. Let us drift gently east to the headquarters of Colonel Norbert Waffleberry, a man whose leadership was matched only by his remarkable collection of precisely 47 identical black umbrellas. Colonel Waffleberry believed deeply that a soldier's dignity was best preserved not through valor or medals, but by remaining moderately dry. Directly across the field, within a makeshift cafe tent, cleverly disguised as a command post, stood General Dampier of the mildly disgruntled opposing army. General Dampier was French, but only barely, in lineage, not in accent, having been raised in Dorset by a family of pigeon enthusiasts. His umbrella beliefs were somehow even stricter. According to Dampier's standing orders, all umbrellas must be of muted earth tones, held no higher than chin level, and never opened indoors unless one was seeking divine forgiveness. So, when Private Grimsby of the Wafflebury Battalion accidentally left his black umbrella propped open on the shared hillock, a mutual no-man's neutral zone where both sides occasionally stood very still to complain about the rain, tensions naturally escalated. A parley was requested, not for surrender nor terms of battle, but to discuss parasol misconduct. You know you've entered the slow center of military history when empires pause offensives to debate umbrella placement. The meeting, which historians later called l'affaire de Bumbershoot, was held beneath a large tarpaulin stretched across two wagons and suspended by poles that groaned under the weight of persistent drizzle. Hot tea was served in soup mugs because their proper cups had been requisitioned during the great teacup shortage of Tuesday. Colonel Wafflebury insisted that black umbrellas, in a monochrome setting, provided much-needed aesthetic consistency. General Dampier argued that such umbrellas clashed with the moody palette of the surrounding mud and hinted at imperialist undertones. Neither man gave ground. What followed was the most drawn-out truce extension in recorded history. 7 hours of umbrella-related negotiation, consisting mostly of long silences, passive-aggressive note-passing, and a prolonged debate over whether drizzle outranks mist on the British Moisture Index. At some point in Hour 4, both commanding officers simultaneously declared the other to be insufferably pedantic, which in officers' terms was basically a dual challenge. But instead of pistols at dawn, far too dramatic, they opted for a rain-off, a stoic contest to see who could stand unmoving in steady precipitation the longest, without unfurling an umbrella or wincing at the dampness in their socks. It went on for 13 hours. Crowds gathered. Bets were placed. Soggy sandwiches were handed out by silent junior officers in admiration. One soldier fainted from sheer ennui and was gently covered with grass. At the end of it, both men simply shivered, gave a curt nod, and declared the matter mutually unresolved. The umbrella was never retrieved. It still stands there today, according to local folklore, leaning defiantly near the old tree stump, now hosting generations of nesting birds and 2 particularly entitled squirrels. What began as a war over logistics, terrain, and imperial ambition had, somewhere along the way, turned into laundry disputes and meteorological one-upmanship. The umbrella became a symbol, a tiny monument to the extraordinary dullness that war can achieve when everyone involved is truly committed to avoiding any actual unpleasantness beyond light mildew. And so, the drizzle dribbled on, like a clock that had given up keeping time and opted instead to nap. As night fell once more on the low, lumpy hills, and boots continued to squelch through puddles that had memorized centuries of tired souls, a new challenge emerged on the horizon, something even duller, even more bureaucratic than previous entanglements. A supply train had arrived, packed entirely with the wrong kind of biscuits. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale for another sleepy night. Ah, the humble sock, an unsung textile hero, endlessly loyal, yet endlessly disrespected by the elements. On the steadily drizzling fields where the most boring battle in the world trudged on, the state of one sock spoke volumes. Crisp, dry socks meant optimism, preparedness, or perhaps suspicious cowardice. Damp, wrung-out socks. That was the uniform of the veteran trench stander. By this point in the battle, which had not involved as much battling as it had an extended, soggy shuffle in circles, the morale of our soldiers, already lukewarm at best, hinged entirely on sock dryness. There were no songs of valor, no banners waved in defiance, just 1,000 marching men quietly squishing with every step. Each morning began with a hopeful sock-changing ceremony. Each evening closed with the slow, ceremonial drying of said socks over underwhelming fires which hissed meekly at the persistent drizzle, as though protesting their own existence. Back then, water-resistant footwear was considered extravagant, rebellious, possibly even French. So most soldiers bore woolen socks that maintained the fancy ability to soak up an entire puddle with just one toe. Efficient in its own soggy way. And yet, despite the dismal circumstances, the army developed what can only be described as moisture morale tactics. Socks were hung in ranks along clotheslines, each soldier's contribution flapping like the world's most unwilling flag. The general, whose boots had filled up so many times that 2 frogs had begun nesting there, allowed a daily sock parade, in which the driest socks from each regiment were marched ceremoniously past the latrine trench. The soldiers clapped politely. The frogs abstained. Of course, the enemy army, camped equally still and equally damp, only 14 paces away across a deeply uninspiring field of squish, held their own daily rituals. Though tactically similar, they added a little flair. Their sock drying procedure involved hanging them on their bayonets, raised like sad, steaming spears of surrender. Someone from their side, perhaps an amateur poet, perhaps just cleverly bored, composed a short epic titled Ode to a Wet Heel, which was shouted across no-brawl land at dusk. It rhymed poorly, but was received with thunderous, sock-muted applause. Now, one might wonder why neither side had retreated, if only to find a drier hill. But the truth was, no one could remember whose hill it was originally. The map, long since carried off by an ambitious field rabbit, had left them with only vague directional instincts and a horizon so grey that it couldn't be trusted. Also, due to a paperwork oversight, both sides mistakenly believed they were winning. And so, the battle dragged on, or rather puddled on, like a particularly damp rehearsal for a historical reenactment that nobody had actually signed up for. The weapon of choice had become the exaggerated sigh, the currency of morale, small wooden tokens exchanged for newspaper scraps to stuff into ineffectual boots. One sergeant smuggled in a kettle and began running a closely guarded toe-warming station, at the cost of 1 sock tribute per use. Amid this watery slog, an unlikely hero emerged, Private Humphrey Tilley, a man of no remarkable character except for being unusually short and therefore less exposed to rainfall. He had, through a series of accidents and wrong turns, discovered an old cellar beneath a ruined farmhouse, bone dry, smelling faintly of onions. There he had hung his socks, which dried so fully, so blissfully, that they crackled when folded. Word spread like wildfire, or at least like a moderately curious puff of damp air. Each night, one lucky soldier, chosen by raffle, would descend into the secret sock cellar to de-wrinkle their toes and hum quietly in honor of their fortune. Humphrey, meanwhile, became something of a local deity, forever crouched over his crate of potato-stuffed socks, whispering gentle things to them like, "You're safe now, and no more puddles." Despite the general lack of action, this chapter in the battle's chronology soon became known as the Soggy Standstill. Poets, bad ones, would one day refer to it as the drizzle that drenched men's souls, though this was perhaps a bit dramatic, considering most souls remained perfectly dry. Still, history has a tendency to overstate sogginess for poetic effect. And as the soldiers' laughter mingled with the distant coo of unhappy pigeons and the slow drip, drip, drip of cloud ambition, they settled in for another monotony-laced evening. with socks gently drying under kettles and spirits as wrinkled as their toes. They dared to dream of a future where one might walk without squish. But of course, in any great boredom, a change must surely come, though no one expected it to arrive by cow. Curl in now, as we shuffle quietly toward the next gentle confusion. The rain, because of course it was still raining, had taken on the determined rhythm of a sleepy tap dancer. Tap, tap, tap on the canvas tents. Tap, tap, schlorp into your already soaked boots. The battlefield had now become more bog than ground, and the only thing advancing that day was trench foot. The generals on both sides were, how shall we put this delicately, conflicted about adventuring out into the puddle-laden plains. Muscles tense from inactivity, minds dulled by days of drizzle, and uniforms that now smelled more of mildew than of valor. Truly, the scent of war had taken a soggy, slightly fungal turn. General Pemberwick of the East Cache Volunteers spent that morning polishing a button on his overcoat, despite the rest of the coat being irreparably stained by 3 weeks of swampy optimism. He sat in his folding chair, under what remained of his command tent, sipping vaguely warm tea with the contemplative air of a man awaiting a train that may never come. His adjutant, young Lieutenant Smemley, who had only joined the army to avoid becoming a dentist, was attempting to keep a log of each day's progress. The notebook was now more papier-mâché than pages, but still, with admirable resolve, he wrote, Day 47. Battle still pending. Enemy not visible. Mud remains loyal. Across the marshy no-man's land, appropriately known to both armies as that awful bit, General Schluth of the Western Drizzle Irregulars was making a tremendously important strategic decision. Which soup to serve to his officers for luncheon? Lentil or leek? The fate of the battle might truly rest on it. And so, after a brief council of war conducted entirely under 3 overlapping umbrellas, he settled on lentil. A brave call. How does one conduct a battle, you might wonder, when no one is entirely sure where the front line has gone, or whether it has, in fact, floated away? Scouts sent the day before had not returned, not because they were slain, but because they found a mildly better campsite 2 miles south and decided not to come back until the rain had stopped. They sent word by a very apologetic duck. The soldiers, for their part, had long given up asking when or how the battle might be fought, and were now more preoccupied with trying to invent new games using soggy bread and stray buttons. One regiment had put together an impromptu string quartet using old tin cans, pieces of string, and a fiddle that may have been half raccoon. Their audiences were small, mostly consisting of slumping men in woolen coats, their expressions somewhere between amused and prune-like. A private from the 19th Glistening Regiment had even written a musical, largely because he was bored and had once seen an opera during shore leave. It featured dramatic solos like My Socks Have Drowned Again and We Shall Charge When Our Porridge Lifts. Surprisingly moving, according to anonymous sources, i.e. Reginald from the soup line. And yet, through all this not quite action, a curious kind of peace began to settle. Not the peace of truce or triumph, but the slow simmering peace that comes when you realize no one's particularly interested in hurling spears through soup fog. The artillery crews spent increasing amounts of time drying their powder and watching ducks perform what could only be called battle drills. One duck repeatedly charged a loaf of bread, wings flapping with the intensity of high command. Some historians might say this reflects the futility of war. Others might say it reflects what happens when your boots weigh more than your cannon. Either way, You'd be surprised just how much camaraderie can build in the shared silence of collective sogginess. Even the horses began to show subtle signs of resolve. One mare named Duchess had taken to leading unplanned parades in the camp every second morning. No one knew why. No one knew how. But everyone agreed it was deeply motivating. Thus, in the whispers of mist and the drowsy gurgles of waterlogged trenches, the two opposing forces remained, opposed mostly in name, but thoroughly united in their desire for dry socks and a bit less lentil in the lentil soup. And as the clouds bruised the sky with tones of evening and the campfires began their nightly struggle against wet kindling, a rumour drifted like gentle smoke across the marsh. Tomorrow might, just might, be dry. Which raises the deeply questionable question: what on earth happens if it is? Sleep now, dear listener, and prepare, for morning might bring movement, or at the very least, mildly drier trousers. As dawn unfurled like a lukewarm pancake across the sleepy hillsides, the battlefield remained, remarkably unbattled. Not a clash had sounded, unless you counted the muffled cursing of overly armoured men tripping over tent ropes and the occasional groan of a war horse who'd much rather have been nibbling oats back at the stables. It was, you see, still raining. Rain had become less of a weather condition and more of a character in this entire affair. The soldiers no longer argued whether the war would ever come. They debated whether one could build gills out of tent canvas and hope for the best. Helmets filled with water, banners drooped like wet spaghetti, and morale, like most of the firewood, was thoroughly soaked. Enter, once again, our noble if misguided knight, Sir Reginald T. Blunderbury, a man so deeply committed to chivalry, he once tried to duel a windmill for looking at him funny. Sir Reginald had not let the weather dampen his spirits, though it had absolutely dampened every other surface, including his undergarments. Around mid-morning, with a fog so thick you could butter it, Sir Blunderbury decided to deliver a rousing speech to his sodden troops. He mounted his steadfast steed, whom he affectionately referred to as General Oatface, and attempted a noble gallop across the muck. It was a slow and squelching gallop, more akin to someone attempting to drag a fainting sofa through a swamp. Raising his soggy arm, the knight bellowed, "Men, fear not the drizzle, for history remembers those who stood firm in the face of, oh drat." He trailed off because his trousers had surrendered to the elements, slipping unceremoniously downward, aided by the weight of a small pond that had formed in each pant leg. There are few things more tragic than a man trying to uphold ancient codes of honor while hoisting up wet breeches in front of 32 archers pretending not to look. And yet somehow, this incident inspired the troops far more than any planned oratory. For in that moment, they saw the noble futility of it all. The mud, the rain, the chafing. They weren't warriors in the classical sense. They were survivors of a very mediocre ordeal. Not far off, on the opposing side, Captain Ludovico de Yorn, whose name shall one day be immortalized in snore-inducing textbooks, was philosophically inspecting his half-collapsed tent. He had decided that war, in the traditional sense, might actually be less productive than forming a reading club. After all, both activities involved long waits, unreliable supplies, and soggy footwear. De Yorn, a man famous for once calling a siege emotionally draining, jotted vigorously into his journal. Day 17, rain, no advancement. Soldiers invented a new game via puddle jumping. It's called Splash and Regret. Morale mixed, porridge still tepid. The truth was, both camps were now entirely unsure what they were even fighting for. The original disagreement, that deeply divisive issue of who rightfully owned a moderately important cabbage market near the border, had long been forgotten. Somehow, the dispute had slipped behind waterlogged paperwork and a rather confusing translation involving the word turnip. Back on the hill, Sir Blunderberry finally relinquished his ambition to read Machiavelli in the mud and accepted graciously that his destiny might simply be to serve as entertainment for generations of bored historians. One of his squires, a lad named Cedric, who bore the expression of someone permanently bracing for a sneeze that never came, asked a sincere question while wringing out his socks. "Sir, do you think the enemy knows we're not actually advancing?" Sir Reginald took a slow breath, allowed his trousers to settle somewhere below tactical visibility, and replied, "Oh, Cedric, I rather think they're counting on it." Meanwhile, across the invisible no man's land, Captain de Yorn stared wistfully into his now entirely flooded soup bowl and mumbled to no one in particular, "Perhaps tomorrow." And so, the battle that wasn't trudged on, not with glory or gore, but with soggy dignity and determined foot fungus. By moonrise, snoring rose like symphonic thunder from both camps, for nothing puts a warrior to sleep faster than damp armor, soggy blankets, and the weight of unresolved cabbage disputes. But just when it looked like peace might finally dribble in between the clouds and puddles, a rather curious letter arrived by mistake, carried not by messenger pigeon, but by the most bewildering means yet. And that, dear dreamer, is where we float next. As the clouds lowly swelled above our soggy battlefield, less of a field now and more of a woolly marsh made entirely of old soup, it occurred to the soldiers on both sides that they were trapped in a mutual agreement of utmost inactivity. Not a spoken agreement, of course. Rather, the type forged silently through weary glances, damp socks, and the sound of bread steadily moulding. Picture it, commanders organizing their maps with all the grandeur of someone arranging tea biscuits, carefully avoiding any maneuver that might suggest enthusiasm. Horses, noble creatures that they are, had begun to wear expressions of existential bemusement. "We were bred for galloping into valorous foolishness," they seemed to say with their eyes, "not for standing ankle-deep in lukewarm oatmeal." And yet, despite being the so-called climax of the campaign, this phase of the battle achieved something no swords, cannons, or strategic aims ever could: a perfect equilibrium of uninterrupted stillness. By now, both camps had accidentally synchronized their routines like two slow-moving orchestras who'd never actually met. At precisely 9 o'clock, someone on one side would very quietly boil a kettle for trench tea, 3 herbs, 0 excitement, while someone on the other side would raise a monocle just high enough to spot clouds that looked suspiciously like turnips. Near the southern knoll, more a lumpy suggestion of height than any strategic prominence, Private Leonard Tibbles of the 8th Wiltshire Slouchers had started writing poetry about the many types of puddle accumulating near his bedroll. He had identified 7 distinct varieties so far, the most notable being the midnight stare, which reflected stars but had never once inspired them. In the enemy camp, across the marsh, Major Alphonse de Chapeau had taken up the habit of narrating the weather to his plants. "Another misty morning, Madame Verbena," he'd coo in a buttery whisper. "War remains indecisive, and your leaves are stunning." Meanwhile, military correspondence from the front was so phenomenally dull that ministers back home began using it as a diplomatic sleep aid. One note: enemy seen rearranging crates. Possible strategic purpose uncertain. Rain still persistent. Was allegedly republished in 6 herbal medicine brochures as a recommended sedative. Gone were the days of cavalry charges and dramatic trumpet solos. No one even remembered what the battle was technically about. A border dispute about a hedge maybe, or the unjust taxation of a particularly unpopular cheese. No matter. Any ambitions of glory had long since sunk beneath the eternal drizzle. And yet, for all this forgettable inactivity, something quietly remarkable was beginning to happen. You see, one must not underestimate the power of monotony to foster thought. In the gently dripping silence of their opposing trenches, men from both sides began to think profoundly. Not grand philosophical "what is truth" type thoughts, no. More manageable ideas like, why do helmets collect rain but repel compliments? Or, if we all just sneezed at once, would that count as a ceasefire? In this warm little puddle of shared boredom, spies became pen pals, enemy bakers exchanged crusts, and even the camp goats developed a suspicious camaraderie, often seen swaying together to lullabies played on out-of-tune flutes. Commanders, increasingly aware that their troops had grown unnervingly content with not fighting, began issuing decrees against excessive knitting and unsolicited whistling. Alas, enforcement proved difficult when half the officers had taken up origami as an emotional coping mechanism, using enemy pamphlets to fold remarkably flattering pigeons. Peace, as it turns out, has many disguises. In some places, it marches in with banners and treaties. Here, it simply arrived by never quite happening. And so, with soggy boots and shuffled maps, the most boring battle in the world hovered in a state of noble napfulness, brimming with the subtle power of doing almost nothing extremely well. As twilight blurred the edges of the wet horizon, and soldiers on both sides tucked themselves into tents smelling faintly of old biscuits and diplomatic ennui, a new question began to take form among the dewdrops and weary snores. If this colossal yawn of a war had indeed become an unspoken truce, then what, pray, were these armies still doing here? Something would have to change, or at least very gently tilt. And that, dear dreamer, is where we drift next. As twilight tiptoed softly over the soggy fields, the air settled into that peculiar kind of stillness reserved for places where not much has happened, and even less intends to. It was here, amid puddles that had remained loyally unchanged for days, and soldiers whose socks had given up hope, that General Albrecht von Drollinger made his entrance, not with trumpets, not with thunder, but with a hat, mind you, that had seen neither battle nor breeze, for it was far too delicate for either, adorned with a single white goose feather, nestled like a dreamy punctuation mark atop a landscape of weary grey. Now, don't let the feather fool you. General von Drollinger was no fool. He simply had a flair for flair, and had grown up in a manor house where peacocks were considered ordinary and understatement was a punishable offence. But this wasn't a manor house, nor was it much of a battlefield. This was a marshy strip of land that had become so soggy and silent that even frogs had filed complaints. And yet General von Drollinger arrived with the air of a man ready to change history, or at the very least, rearrange its furniture. The rain politely continued, drizzling just enough to avoid attention, as an aide-de-camp trailed behind the general, holding up soggy maps and attempting not to slip in socks that were, by this time, more theoretical than textile. "Where are the enemy lines?" the general inquired gently, squinting through a lorgnette that did very little to magnify anything and considerably more to fog up. The aide pointed vaguely toward a hill that had once been mildly strategic, but now functioned mainly as a sheep perch. "And what is our tactical position?" "Well, replied the aide, choosing his words like one selects cheese near the end of a long dinner. "We are currently positioned behind the most formidable hedge in this region, sir." "Ah, a botanical stronghold," murmured the general. "Excellent. Time for tea then." Though his men had expected battle orders, they'd long since gotten used to awaiting nothing more than weather updates and the occasional philosophical musing about soup. And so, with kettle boiling over a pebble-warmed fire pit, General von Drollinger hosted his daily strategy session under a tilted canvas awning, punctuated by the occasional drip and a noble attempt to keep damp biscuits from dissolving on impact. History records many great generals for their valor, cunning, or at the very least, punctuality. Von Drollinger, however, is remembered for his astounding ability to outweight rain clouds, while his counterpart across the field, an equally uninspired commander by the name of Major Chortlwaite, busied himself drawing increasingly elaborate plans with equally diminishing returns. The general remained perched under his awning, quietly observing the natural decay of enthusiasm. There were rumors, of course, that von Drollinger once outmaneuvered a rival army by simply waiting until their horses grew bored and wandered off, that he had mastered the delicate art of strategic delay, a battle tactic involving folding chairs and trickle-down patience. None of it confirmed, but all of it very damp. Once, a soldier dared to ask the general what he thought the enemy was planning. "They are likely doing what we are doing," he said, with a serene nod, "wondering what we are doing." And so, the days collected like sleepy raindrops on a tin roof. Muskets rusted into heirlooms, trumpets became flower pots, and fall arrived, not with a charge, but with the gentle rustle of leaves disinterestedly retiring for the season. The only recorded movement came when von Drollinger's goose-feather hat was momentarily claimed by a particularly assertive breeze and landed, scandalously, in the enemy's pickled onion barrel. It was promptly returned with a note of apology and a half-eaten biscuit. Diplomacy, it would seem, was not entirely out of bounds. And so, the battle that never quite battled lingered one day longer, tucked into the folds of muddied uniforms and unspoken agreements. Somewhere far away, distant cannons made muffled sounds like someone dropping kettles down stone stairways. But here, in the heart of forgettable glory, history yawned and stretched and leaned gently back into a lull. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't fought with swords or shouted from horses. Sometimes they are brewed quietly, steeped until strong, and sipped beneath a heavy sky by a man in a feathered hat who understood, perhaps better than most, that peace often comes disguised as patience. And as the drizzle danced once more upon the broad, waiting shoulders of the world's most uneventful battlefield, a single thought tiptoed through the mist. Something, just maybe, was finally about to happen. But that is a whisper for another chapter. So at last, the drizzle fades to a mist, the mud turns from splashy to spongy, and the battle, if we can call it that, ends not in fire and fury, but in yawns and damp socks. Welcome to the final moments of the most boring battle in the world, where dreams march slower than armies and goose feathers had more drama than swords. It was, fittingly, a Thursday. The two sides, each more reluctant than the other, had finally agreed to a ceasefire over lukewarm broth and a shared distaste for trench foot. Not because any grand strategy had unfolded, not because flags had fallen or heroes had risen, but mostly because everyone was cold, tired, vaguely pruny, and painfully aware that their horses had started judging them. You see, no epic speeches were made, No statues would be raised. There wasn't even a battle cry, unless you count Private Reggie belting out, "I think my boot is pudding now," as he sank once again into the consistency of week-old oatmeal that was the battlefield. On this last day, the sun made a half-hearted attempt to shine, looming behind the clouds like a sleepy librarian trying not to get involved. A single trumpet sounded, not dramatically, but more like someone exhaling through a rusty teapot. Then, as if choreographed by indecisiveness itself, both sides simply wandered off. Some shook hands, some shared biscuits. One pair of rival commanders even exchanged glances that said, with silent understanding, "Let's never do this again." It's easy to romanticize war, stories of valor, courage, sacrifice. But here, in the most boring battle in the world, valor wore soggy wool, courage complained about its blisters, and sacrifice mostly involved someone giving up their last dry muffin. Not a single soldier died gloriously. In fact, the only injuries sustained during the entirety of engagement were 2 turned ankles, a misplaced bayonet slice to a particularly defensive cabbage, and an unfortunate near-choking incident involving an overconfident corned beef sandwich. The records show, quite literally, nothing of note. No songs were sung after. No poems immortalized the conflict, except perhaps one poorly rhymed limerick penned by an enthusiastic but shivering young corporal. There once was a war very bland, where no one quite took a firm stand. We marched in the rain, then stood in the lane, and mostly just slipped in the sand. It did not win any awards. Still, amid the yawns and squelching boots, an odd kind of magic lay. It was not a grand sweeping magic, the sort that rides chariots of fire or shapeshifts in the woods, but a very sleepy kind. The magic that appears when people decide they're simply too tired to fight. For in this gentle absurdity of sodden banners and lukewarm soup, the soldiers found camaraderie. And not the kind that demands bravery on bloody fields, but the quieter, cozier bond of grumbling together under one poorly staked tent as rain trickles down your collar in sync. It's said that afterwards, the two sides wrote up peace terms entirely composed on soggy parchment, most of which melted halfway through negotiations. Details remain sketchy, but we do know that trade resumed, families were reunited, and at least one enterprising scribe opened a tavern called the Drenched Musket. For generations after, no one quite remembered what the battle had been about. Scholars squinted at mouldy maps and speculated wildly. Some claimed it was over land. Others say it was a misunderstanding over goose tax policy. A few blamed the soup, perhaps rightly so. And so, the war that was waged in whispers and watery yawns dissolved gently into history's least visited archives, where dusty scrolls whisper tales of the world's quietest clash. Tonight, as your own blankets wrap round you like woolen treaties, imagine the squelch of muddy boots turning homeward, the final trumpet sighing itself to sleep, and the last puddle rippling under one soldier's sleepy snore. Wars may be won, empires may rise and fall, but this battle, this very boring, very rainy little battle, it faded not with a bang or a blaze, but with a fried bread crust shared between slow-footed friends. And now, dear dreamer, the last footstep has squished into the muddy pages of this sleepy story. The tents are folded, the chow is lukewarm, and history, a little damp, a little daft, and thoroughly drowsy, settles in beside you with a sigh. Close your eyes, the battle is over. Sleep well, soldier.